Hi, this is Scott Wilkinson, host of Home Theater Geeks. In episode 111, I chat with Juergen Herre about his work in perceptual audio codecs. So stay tuned.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is TWiT.
Bandwidth for Home Theater Geeks is provided by Cachefly at CACHEFLY.com.
This is Home Theater Geeks with Scott Wilkinson, recorded May 14th, 2012. Episode 111, Perception is Everything. This episode of Home Theater Geeks is brought to you by Netflix. Watch thousands of TV episodes and movies on your PC, Mac, iPad, iPhone, or TV instantly. All streamed directly to you, saving you time, money, and hassle. For your free 30-day trial, go to netflix.com/twit. Hey there, Scott Wilkinson here, online editor of HomeTheater.com. This week's guest geek is Juergen Herre. Sorry, let me try that again. Juergen Herre. Try to get the German a little bit right anyway. Okay, try it again. 1, 3, 2. Let's get me back up. Thank you. 3, 2. Hey there, Scott Wilkinson here, online editor of HomeTheater.com. This week's guest geek is Juergen Herre, a professor at Erlangen University and the chief scientist at Fraunhofer IIS, Institute for Integrated Circuits. I'll get that right at some point. Hey, Juergen, welcome to the show.
Hi, Scott. Thank you for letting me be on the show.
Well, thank you so much for being here, joining us from Germany, in fact, which is why we're on an hour earlier than usual, so that we don't keep you up too late.
Oh. Wow, I really do appreciate that, I can tell you.
Now, of course, those of you who are watching the live show here at live.twit.tv or logged into the chat room at irc.twit.tv can post questions for Juergen, and I will pass along as many as I can. Now, today we're going to be talking about perceptual coding. And the most famous example of that is MP3, which we're all very familiar with, and which, Juergen, you helped in the development of this now ubiquitous coder, we call it, or codec for coder decoder. How did the whole idea of MP3 come about, and how was it developed?
Well, the story goes back quite a bit, and there was actually a professor at Erlangen University. His name was Dieter Seitzer, and he was, as he told me recently, actually, he's retired by now, he was working on sort of trying to compress fax images and things like that. And at some kind of, you discuss between colleagues, and at sometimes you come up with some crazy ideas. And he said, how would we then encode audio? And then he went on, why would we want to do that? Well, for fax, it was quite clear you can transmit images like on paper copies. But then again, he said, at some point there's going to be this new integrated services digital network, ISDN. And that was a very modern technology that would have come up at that point in time. And he said, wouldn't it be possible to shift good quality audio across these inexpensive digital lines at some point? So he thought hard about it, had some first initial thoughts, and in fact he was trying to make some first ideas, try to file for patent. The patent examiners, the examiner told him, this is crazy stuff. I'm not going to buy into that. Sorry, I cannot let that.
The patent examiner wouldn't grant a patent because he thought it was crazy?
Yes, absolutely. He thought this can't be done. And then, Professor Seitzer said, the privilege of a professor is that you would try to find some clever, for instance, PhD students. And then he found actually some of them, and the most famous being Karl-Heinz Brandenburg. He was a person who really did some seminal work on that, and he brought things quite a bit ahead. And that was the beginning of a whole, huge a kind of movement and a huge kind of development that ramped up like almost exponentially, you could say.
Mm-hmm.
And just to tell about myself in that story.
Yes, please.
I had studied electrical engineering at Erlangen University, and actually my master's thesis was on a totally different topic. It was about testing of integrated circuits with an E-beam tester, that is like an electron beam microscope, something like that. But then I had to look for a job. And next door, in the other half of the building where I had been doing my master's thesis, actually diploma thesis, there was a kind of working group of the Fraunhofer Institute, and they were working on something for digital audio broadcasting. Well, I said to myself, well, this sounds really interesting. And I've always been interested in music, and always been doing a lot of music, guitars and synthesizer and violin and accordion and so on. And so I said, well, that sounds interesting, so I'm going to join. And disappointingly in the beginning, I was sort of actually hired for a totally different project. But then again, the project started late. It was a little delayed, and a colleague of mine said, I really like you to program something for this DAP project. And so I got into it. So he gave me a huge pile of user manuals of a DSP, a Motorola DSP, and my head was sort of almost exploding when I was reading for these low-level assembler instructions. But that was the way where we were programming things at that point in time. Wow. And so I got dragged into that project, and I never regretted that.
Sort of sideways, I guess, coming in from the side a little unexpectedly.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Yes, absolutely. And, seeing sort of in retrospect, there was a point in time and during school, the late school years, where I had to decide what should I do. And decision would be either become a musician or do something more solid, so to speak. In other words, some engineering kind of profession. And so I opted for engineering, and sort of the circle was closing in the sense that finally I found myself approaching music, but from the technical side rather than the musical one itself.
Wow. You and I actually have very similar backgrounds, because I am also a musician, but as was my father. And when I was trying to decide what to do with my life, he sort of said to me, "You can be anything in life you want as long as you're happy, and as long as you're not a musician."
Well, I guess
now he was only half joking, because he himself was a musician, but he also knew that being a musician was not a very secure life, shall we say.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So, and I did much the same thing. I went into synthesizers and music recording and recording studios and so on, digital audio, and came at it from a technical point of view as well. And now what I do is I write about and report about these things, which I'm inherently interested in. So it combined sort of my interests in the technical and the musical, sort of right brain, left brain, if you will. And it sounds like you did much the same thing.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And I'm still doing a lot of music, but that is just a hobby. And I think it's good the way it is.
Mm-hmm.
Because then, if you're not you don't have to do it under any kind of pressure. You just do it for fun. That is really rewarding.
Yes, you can take the gigs you want to, and you don't have to take every single gig that comes along.
Absolutely.
Now, I'm getting some questions in the chat room already, so I'll just intersperse them with my own. John in Dorset asks, what's happening with Potato System, which apparently was something that Fraunhofer were co-developers in, and he says that Potato was a bar where they met, I think. Do you know about this?
Oh, yeah, I heard about it. It was quite a while ago. Frankly, I'm not sure. That must have been
not sure if there's anything there. Okay.
Yeah.
Understood.
And
that's
there's also Yeah.
Rorex in the chat room asks, and I'm pretty sure I know the answer. Were psychoacoustics ever taken into account with any codecs prior to layer 3, or in other words, MP3? And we should say, first of all, that MP3 is shorthand. What is the full name of that codec?
So the full name sounds much less catchy. It would be MPEG-1 layer 3. And that sounds a little cryptic, but essentially it says, hey, this is the first project that the Moving Pictures Expert Group, or short MPEG as a standardization group, has undertaken. And it is from this audio codec that was defined in this MPEG-1 phase. Actually, this was not a single audio codec. It was a family of 3 audio codecs called layers. And there's a layer 1, a layer 2, and a layer 3. And with the increasing number, you sort of get an increase in compression efficiency. But of course, you also have to spend a little more cycles. So the algorithm gets more sophisticated and more complex.
So in other words, it requires more processing power to achieve.
Right. And that, of course, today is not an issue anymore. If you look at that, the encoder is by far more complex than the decoder. And even that runs, I mean, if you read it in a CD, digitize it, you can easily have like 10 times real time and even more, much more. So that's not an issue anymore. But in 1992, when the standard was finalized, this was a big issue. And when we developed that, we hardly had any chance developing it on any mini computer or let alone PC. So we really had to use these kinds of DSPs, cardboards with DSP processors on them, several of them, 3, 4, 5. The first MP3 encoder had 5 DSP boards in it, and it was all custom-built software. Hardware and software, of course, too. So,
and look how far we've come since in only 20. Well, it's been 20 years now, right? 1992.
Yes, absolutely. And of course, 92 was the year when standardization on MPEG-1 was finished. So really, people have been working on that starting 87. Was the first real-time codec. Of a predecessor of MP3. So it's been quite a few, quite lively
yes,
years.
Indeed. So getting back to Rorex's question, were psychoacoustics taken into account from the very beginning?
Well, not from the very beginning. I mean, people have been, let me put it that way, bitrate audio coding or low bitrate coding of audio signals. Actually, the first applications were motivated by telephony. So if you wanted to get more telephone lines across a digital network, for instance, people at Bell Labs did a lot, and many others did some research on that. And so you come up with things like DPCM, ADPCM, things like that. But these did not take into account psychoacoustics. So that's totally correct. That was not there in the beginning. You try to squeeze out what we call redundancy out of the signal. In other words, you try to get it into more compact representation, pretty much in the way as, for instance, a zip computer program would do that. It tries to represent things more compactly. And
except in a zip file, you'd better have bit for bit perfect decoding at the other end. Or else your file will be useless. Whereas in this case, we're talking about what's called lossy compression, where you're actually throwing away a lot of information.
Right. So if you just look at a zip file, this is pure redundancy reduction or entire lossless compression. And if you look at a kind of audio codec, you have some loss there if you go to lower bit rates. Because you really lower the bitrate to some extent. But then, of course, in order to make things as smart as possible, you also use redundancy reduction in order to, and that will always give you better results because it combines some of the things that you transmit are then being losslessly encoded and being more compact. But of course, that's only part of the story, because for a good audio coder, exploiting psychoacoustics and what we call irrelevancy is, of course, a key to a real good sound. And that means that this is not applying what I would call blind signal processing or mathematics, but it is informed about what our human auditory system, and the ear is, of course, only the outer part of that, the outermost part, what this is about, what it can perceive, what it likes, what it dislikes, and so on.
Well, that, of course, brings us to the area of bit rate. And as you mentioned, lower bit rates means that you throw away more information, and I presume the audio quality drops as well. I mean, I think that's pretty obvious. We had a question in the chat room about that. Let me just scroll back up to it real quick. A Beatmaster asks, as a musician, at which point do you yourself stop lowering the bit rate? Is it 320 kilobits per second, or do you just listen to PCM all the way?
Well, to be quite honest, if I store things at home, like reading CDs onto my hard disk, I just use 192 kilobits per second, right? So that is that's something that I find a good compromise between compaction and sonic quality. I don't have any reason to complain under normal
at 192.
192, yes. Now, of course, everyone is free to choose that, and that is exactly one of the core points that come along with these kind of perceptual audio coders. Because if you use traditional formats like PCM, say on CD, you've got this 44.1 kilohertz sampling rate, you've got 16 bits per sample, 2 channels, so that brings you up to 1.5 megabits per second. And that's what you've got. You can't have more, you can't get less. But with perceptual audio coders, of course, you have this additional thingy, that knob that gives you control over how much bits you use. And that is, of course, a feature that is great, because it's the feature that makes all the difference. Because if you have a kind of channel that cannot carry very much, say, broadcast radio, internet radio channel, well, there's no chance you get 1.5 megabits across.
No.
So you can turn it down. Right. But then again, of course, as you said, there will always be a point you can turn it down frequently to an extent that quality will start suffering. And that's where responsibility comes into the play, because it's just a little too easy to say, hey, it sounds bad, because you can always pretty much make it good sounding if you just spend enough bit rates. And these days, that's just different from what it used to be back in 92, where 128 kilobits per second was much data rate. I know for the first distribution of MP3, we were kind of sort of distributing shareware encoders. And of course, we had to distribute a little and decoders with it that would play in real time on a PC. And of course, we had to sort of distribute some content along with it. And so I sort of composed and arranged and recorded a little item that was called Funky. And it was, bitrate was 128 kilobits per second. And I cut it to, was it 2.5 or 3 minutes? And that exactly fitted on this 3.5-inch floppy disk. Right. So you see the relations, right? And that's why things really were critical at that point in time. But these days, if it's not about wireless transmission, if it's not about internet transmission, there's no reason to go really that low as, say, 64 kilobits per second or 96 and so on.
Mm-hmm. Now, how would you describe the audible effect of as you lower the bit rate more and more and more? What happens to the sound? I mean, you lose highs, or What?
Yeah, I mean, there's different things. Of course, as you said before, there's less information that we can convey to the ear. And of course, the codec tries to be clever and smart and tries to make the best of it, of what it has. And so there's frequency coefficients that are transmitted internally. These are getting coarser. And some of the things you'll notice is that tonal components, very tonal, pure tonal components, may get a little bit more rough quality. Sometimes, if you go, and of course, if you go below a certain point, good codecs would voluntarily limit the audio bandwidth, because it's just better to be rather clean on what you transmit in the band that you actually choose to transmit, as opposed to forcing really, really high bandwidth, but then not being halfway clean in what you transmit.
I see. So the codec would then say drop the high frequency that it's trying to represent. It would just ignore it and go up only to 15K or 10K or whatever. Right.
And I mean, if you think about it, how many years have we been living with just telephone quality? Well, it's a bandwidth of 3.4 kilohertz, and that's all there is to it. But
true. And phone calls, though, but phone signals, all they care about is the vocal range, and most of the consonants sit in the 2 to 4 kilohertz range, and so if that gets through and not much else, that's sort of okay.
Sort of okay, but you know that with regular telephone, there's the sibilants, which have components beyond that, and that's why people have been going on to wideband coders, because frequently it's hard to distinguish between S and F, for instance.
Yeah, true. Right? Yes. Good point. Very good point. What about somebody in the chat room asked before we actually started the show the difference between constant bit rate and variable bit rate?
Well, if you just to understand what variable bit rate is, it means that essentially the codec would try to analyze the incoming sound, would try to see how many bits it would need to represent the sound in a way that respects psychoacoustics. And now, as it turns out, depending on the signal, sometimes this requires more bits, and sometimes this requires less bits. And now these audio coders all process tiny little snippets of audio, for instance, like segments of around 20 milliseconds. So based for each of these frames, you could have a higher or lower bit demand. And if you allow the codec to do that, this is what is called variable bitrate coding. And so that means that in practice, this means there are certain pieces in an audio item that may be especially critical. So for instance, there's a well-known, like a kind of very critical piece, which is a solo castanet. Someone plays this solo castanet, and every time this castanet hits the attack, there's a high demand in bitrate. And of course, if you have a variable bitrate coder, then the coder is free to really grab a lot of bits just for this particular frame in order to be good and handle this very well. And now that is variable bitrate coding. But then again, most practical coders use what is called constant bitrate coding. So you give so you select this bitrate and you say, hey, please constrain yourself to that bitrate. And that means there may be easy passages, so you can happily burn some more bits until you get up to the nominal bitrate. Or you sort of, if it's really tough, please constrain yourself to that bitrate. But then again, there's most of the time, what is really going on under the hood is not absolutely constant bitrate, because there's a kind of limited variable bitrate coding. It's called a bit reservoir, and it's sort of working like your bank account. So if the codec if you would be the codec and you're about to sort of encode a particular frame and you see, oh, that's pretty easy. You can sort of pay back some bits into your bit account. And when the first attack of the castanet hits, you'll retrieve a lot of these bits and forward at this particular frame and be fine.
I would think that would be very difficult with flamenco music, in which the castanets are going constantly.
Right, but then again, I mean, this is not an attack with 20 milliseconds beats behind each other. So I guess if there's half a second sort of break in between the attacks, you find most of the time.
Yeah,
if
no
you've got
problem.
a well-designed encoder, of course.
Right. I'm thinking though more about the flamenco dancers who have the castanets and they're going brr, 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 like that. And I bet you there's not even 20 milliseconds between each of those hits.
Yeah. But then again, if they are very, very densely spaced, again, psychoacoustic kicks in because there's something called post-masking. In other words, sort of in an oversimplified way, after each attack, your ears a little deaf for a little while. And
so some number of milliseconds.
Yes. Some 20, 30 milliseconds, and of course that depends on a number of factors like level and so on. But there is some effect, and so if things get really dense, psychoacoustics again kicks in and then is on the friendly side.
Mm-hmm. I was going to ask you to explain a little bit more about the psychoacoustics. You just mentioned one great example of what's called post-masking, I guess, which is the ear becomes a little deaf for 20, 30 milliseconds after a certain sound, depending on the level and the frequency. What other psychoacoustical parameters does the codec need to be considering and thinking about?
Well, the most basic effect is, of course, not post-masking, but simultaneous masking. So in other words, what actually happens if you present a kind of sound, you play a kind of sound to the ear, and then there's a second sound. And
simultaneous to the first.
So both sounds sound at the same time. Mm-hmm. And so what happens is that the stronger sound sort of tends to suppress the fainter sound if both occupy similar regions within the spectrum. And that is, of course, something that if you look at it from a psychoacoustics point of view, it may sound difficult, but in fact, everyone knows it from everyday life. Just imagine you walk along a kind of countryside and you heard some birds chirping and things like that. And of course, a few seconds later, a truck would pass by. Well, at the very moment the truck passes by, you will not any longer hear the birds chirping. And that is not because they would stop. It's just because your ear would mask, the stronger sound would mask the weaker one. And of course, that kind of effect has got there's a lot of factors involved. Like, for instance, a lower note is much better in masking a higher note than the other way around. And if you were a composer or an arranger of something orchestral piece, you know that, for instance, say the double bass would be much better in masking a kind of a flute than the other way around, right?
Okay. So the codec takes into account all of these factors.
Yes.
These you're talking about, and others, I'm sure, as well, in order to decide what to discard in the way of frequency information.
Right. So another important factor would, for instance, be the distinction between tonal sounds and noise-like sounds. So noise-like sounds are good maskers. Tone-like sounds are very weak maskers. There's a lot of difference between them. So the codec would even look at whether the music, which is the masker, is tonal or noise-like in each particular frequency region. And the masked sound is sort of the imprecision that comes from low bitrate audio coding. So in other words, it's what we call coding distortion, coding noise, coding error. whatever. And this is what is supposed to be masked underneath the music. And that's the principle behind it.
Beatmaster in the chat room asks about MP3 surround. Is there such a thing? Did it ever go anywhere? He claims that it never took off, or he asks, did I miss something?
Well, yes, there is something like that as MP3 surround. Let me first briefly explain what it is about. And so if you look at the MPEG 1 kind of specification, well, all these coders, they support mono coding or stereo coding. And there was never a kind of official multi-channel MP3 version. There was some provisions for that in MPEG-2 multi-channel, but that did not take off. And so while Beck will try to come up with a kind of surround extension for MP3 users that would be able to carry surround surround sound, that is 5.1 surround sound, at the same time be backward compatible. In other words, you could play it on your regular iPad, and you would get stereo. And of course, if you then play it back on an extended decoder, you will get 5.1, and the bitrate would not be substantially higher than regular MP3. And yes, we developed something, that system called MP3 Surround. It had a little, yes, we posted on a website. It found some applications, but it was not adopted as broadly as we had hoped it.
Speaking of which, John in Dorset asks, Fraunhofer were going to allow their codec to be used until some time ago, a few years ago, and then started charging a license fee. What's the status of that?
I'm not sure what he's alluding to. I mean, if you're talking about the MP3 encoder that has been around on the internet, the idea was to create the decoder was freeware, and then there was a shareware encoder. So, but that was always sort of a little shareware that always went with a little shareware fee. And then, of course, what happened is that some person, we found out much later whom it was, in sort of I believe it was in Latin America, he sort of cracked this the encoder and sort of removed this kind of licensing key thing and patched the encoder, and it said now, courtesy of Fraunhofer, everyone is free to use, and that really spread across the internet like faster than the speed of light, and people have been using it for a long time. Well, it was not intended, but well, there's upsides and there's downsides, but there's also upsides. It really increased, of course, the popularity and the usage of that, and people have been using that quite a bit. Well, but then not too many years later, there have been freely available sort of encoders as part of regular software products. I believe the first one was the Music Match Jukebox, but also nowadays, for instance, if you've got iTunes and so on, this is free software, and you're welcome to use it, and it contains high quality MP3 encoders, right?
Rorix asks about unsanctioned implementations, like one he calls lame. I've never heard of that one. Have you?
Yes, of course. Yes. Now, as we explained earlier, MP3 is the abbreviation for MPEG-1 layer 3. Yes. And what is MPEG? MPEG is a standardization group, and it's an open standard. That means what this group does, it works on a specification, which is just essentially a pile of paper, and you can buy and obtain that kind of documentation from ISO. You can also, which is the International Standards Organization, and you can also buy some reference software to go along with that. And the objective is, of course, that everyone, that this specification is freely available and everyone is welcome to do their own implementations. Now, as things are, there's 3 parts of the specification. One is an encoder, the other one is the bitstream format, and the third one is the way the decoder works. And now MPEG decided to standardize as little as possible. In other words, what was fixed in the standard is the format of the bitstream and the way the decoder exactly operates. And that is enough to guarantee that on a worldwide basis, every MP3 bitstream is understood by every MP3 decoder.
There you go. It needs to be completely standardized. You're right.
Right, but not completely, because it's just parts number 2 and 3. And the trick is really that the encoder is not standardized. It's you can do it in very different ways, and you can do it faster and slower, and you can do it more cleverly and less cleverly. And the nice thing was that people decided for this kind of minimum standardization because they knew, hey, we're just at the beginning of learning about psychoacoustics, signal processing, all these strategies. And so they left the door open for future improvements. And yes, if we look at today's encoders, MP3 encoders, they are much better than what we had in 92. And they're at least like a factor of 10 or even more faster. So it's not just that the computers get faster, but it's also the algorithms that got faster while preserving the quality. And that is, of course, really what the merit is. And so, for instance, getting back to LAME, this is just another implementation. It's actually a part of the ISO reference software, which is not what we call a real great encoder. But people have been working on top of that and improving it. And so that's what's available is there. And that's in the nature of things, because an open standard is not something that someone can do exclusively, but it's about specification being open and available to everyone.
I have to say, I think the name they came up with for that one, lame, I mean, that's a pretty lame name, is it not? I mean, it kind of has a negative connotation, if you ask me.
Well, I guess you could tell that this was not any person working in a PR department that came up with that name.
True enough. I'll grant you that. Okay, probably a scientist.
Yes, probably at the university.
Very good. Well, we've got other questions in the chat room, and I've got other questions of my own. So before we continue, though, I do want to take a moment to thank our sponsor for this episode, which is Netflix, which, of course, uses lots of compression to be able to stream video, TV shows, and movies, thousands of them, in fact, over the internet directly to your home through just about any device you can think of. TVs have Netflix apps, Blu-ray players, gaming consoles, iPhones, some Android phones, iPad, just about any consumer electronics device that you care to name probably has a Netflix app on it, allowing you to stream thousands of TV episodes and movies directly into your home for viewing on any device that can show video. You can even start on one and finish on another. I've been using it lately to catch up, watch again a series that I found very interesting that's not even available, as far as I know, on DVD or Blu-ray, called Earth 2. If you get a chance to check that out, it's pretty interesting, actually. Standard def and 4:3, but very interesting content, I find. In any event, that's only one example of what I'm doing with Netflix these days, and I find it so convenient to be able to find what I want to watch, whether or not it's available on disc. And so that's one of the great advantages of Netflix. Now, for TWiT listeners, Netflix is offering a free 30-day trial. All you have to do is go to netflix.com/twit. Be sure to use that URL when you sign up for your 30-day free trial. That's netflix.com/twit. And we thank Netflix for their support of Home Theater Geeks and the entire TWiT network. So, Juergen, getting back to our discussion about perceptual coding, and that's really what we're talking about here, is the way in which audio information can be compressed in such a way that even if you throw away information, what you perceive still sounds like the original. I mean, have I got that definition more or less correct?
Yes, more or less. Yeah, I mean, I would say it is the art of getting bit rate, lowering bit rate, while at the same time keeping as much quality as it is possible. And you could sort of like see that. Suppose you would build any kind of audio encoder that would not use psychoacoustics, and if you then sort of on top of that incorporate psychoacoustics, it would improve.
Right. Curtis B in the chat room asks, is there any advantage to compressing individual tracks differently? So, for example, the drum track versus the guitar track or so on, as opposed to the entire mix all at the same time in the same way. Have you ever heard of anybody doing that?
I could understand things in two ways. It's like, suppose you've got a CD and you would sort of, for each song, you would choose different settings. Well, you could do that, but I wouldn't think that you would gain a big advantage, except for the certain tracks would be quite different in characteristics. Say, for instance, you would have this one solo castanet track, or maybe glockenspiel, whatever kind of very, very special signals. And of course, if you were thinking about, say, for instance, representing a kind of music mix, not by the mix, which is then encoded as a whole, but you would then sort of try to compress the individual tracks and then transmit all of them and then do a down mix. This is something that we would call object-based audio coding. And that's something that people have thought of in the realm of MPEG-4 quite a while ago. It hasn't been sort of used in the marketplace because it's like if you'd like to have like 10 different instruments, 15, 20 instruments, of course you don't want to spend 20 times the bit rate of a mono sound.
Right. Well, that you bring up MPEG-4, and that was really my next question, because which is, what is beyond MP3? I know we have MPEG-2 AAC, Advanced Audio Coder.
Correct. Right.
And there are others as well. What came after MP3? Bruce in the chat room is asking, why did Apple pick AAC as their codec of choice?
Okay. So let me try to give you a little short walkthrough for the history of audio coding development, so to speak. And first thing, and I'm talking about MPEG standards here. There's been other coders as well, but MPEG has been pretty good in sort of driving the state of the art. And of course, we were with MP3, that is layer 1. MPEG-1, layers 1 to 3. Then we had an MPEG-2, which essentially had two parts. One part was making it easier for the PCs at that point in time to play back files. And that's because they had to struggle with the workload of real-time decoding. And I do remember the times when I saw the first MP3 decoders, real-time decoders, and as soon as you would start wiggling around with the mouse, the playback would get interrupted. It would get flaky. Right. And therefore, people said, let's be smart and define additional half-sampling rates, which cuts computation down by a factor of 2. And that was MPEG-2 audio. There was also a multi-channel flavor of it. But this really had some backward compatibility constraints, and which is why people said, what we actually like to have is a surround coder that would be able to have best quality and not be constrained by backward compatibility. And that is what then became, 5 years later, MPEG-2 Advanced Audio Coding, or AAC. And there's different flavors of that. There's an MPEG-2 flavor of it, and an MPEG-4 flavor of it. But this is what Apple then picked for their iTunes format. And of course, you have encoders in iTunes software as well. And well, the decoder is like, I would say, as a rule of thumb, it's about 30% more efficient than MP3. It's sort of advanced in certain aspect, and it's fully multi-channel capable, so it could carry 5.1, 7.1. Actually, you could have up to like 48 audio channels, and if you really wanted, 16 subwoofer channels as well.
Just what I want, a 48.16 system, yeah.
Yeah, and I guess that would be probably pretty good dealing with your tuba concert, right?
Exactly. There you go. Precisely. Very good. Okay.
And that MPEG-4 sort of was defining, in fact, different kind of extensions to AAC. One would be like scalable extension. In other words, you could drop part of the bit stream and it would still decode, even though, of course, at a lower quality. This is something useful if you run over limited capacity, like internet connections. And so, in principle, if things get tough, you could go to the drop part of the bit stream.
Which is somewhat like DTS, which does the same thing. DTS HD is a high-end codec, but if for some reason someplace in the system doesn't have the capability to reproduce it, it can always downshift to the lossy, what they call the core. So it's a similar concept.
Yes, that's a similar concept. And the same is, of course, available for AAC. So there's something called HD AAC, high definition AAC. And the principle is that you have a lossy core, which goes down, has the capabilities of AAC, and then you can scale up things all the way to near lossless and then fully lossless representation with more bit, higher word lengths, not just 16 bits, but 20, 24 bits, and higher sampling rates up to 192 kilohertz sampling rates. So everything you ever wanted.
So we've gotten to MPEG-4. I believe there's also an MPEG-7 and an MPEG-D. What are those?
Oh, yes. First of all, MPEG likes to be a little bit, unpredictable in its numbering. And so after MPEG-2 was MPEG-4, then there's no MPEG-5, 6. Their next one is 7. After that came 21, and then MPEG started switching over to letters. So there's MPEG A, B, C, and so on. And we're currently about to work on MPEG-H. Now MPEG-7 is a totally different animal. It's not about compression at all. And the idea was that, since we have compression, a lot of content is being created, and there's estimates about the billions of MP3 files on the planet and so on. And that, of course, the same holds true for videos and so on. And so what you get pretty soon into is a problem of finding your stuff. It's not about having or not having it. It's about finding stuff.
Good point.
And so that's the next generation problem, so to speak. And so the answer to that is really called metadata and search and retrieval. So you should be able to find with a few mouse clicks specific songs, specific mood, specific rhythm, genre, what have you. And that is what MPEG-7 is about. It's called Multimedia Description Interface. And it's essentially, it describes like a unified language of giving a coarse but sort of semantically meaningful description of what's inside, of visual and in audio. And so that enables people to build search engine like, say, kind of Google for music, or video, and you could then build sort of fast search engine and find your whatever you look for under tons of multimedia material very quickly.
Gotcha. And then what about the lettered ones?
Right. The lettered ones, I mean, there's a lot of different things, and of course, MPEG, it's MP, Moving Pictures Experts Group. So there's a lot of video stuff also about, there's binary formats for bit streams and things like that. But the audio parts, the audio standards of the lettered ones, there's currently two of them. One is MPEG-D, and the other one is MPEG-H. And the latter one is about 3D audio, and maybe we'll get to talk about that also a little later then.
Yes, absolutely. We've got about 10 minutes left, and I do want to talk about that. Also, object-oriented mixing and audio, which is actually very, very interesting. But first of all, I want to just ask you really quickly, do you do anything at all with video codecs, or are you strictly an audio guy?
Well, I'm pretty much an audio guy. There's some parallels between visual coding and and audio coding. So if you really sort of compare the structure of, say, an MP3 encoder codec with that of, say, a JPEG one, there's some generic similarities. But that having said, I'm really into audio.
Yeah, as a musician, I can certainly understand. Well, let's talk about then 3D audio and object-oriented audio, because I've had a number of people on the show who have worked on 3D audio algorithms that take even a pair of speakers or a sound bar and attempt to move the audio into more of a hemispherical sound field. Is that what you're talking about here when you're mentioning 3D audio?
Well, essentially, 3D audio is something where you could say you've got all three dimensions. You've got the lateral, left, right kind of, and front, back kind of component. You've got something that indicates sort of, is it proximity or is it far distant? And you have height, of course. And surround sound, classical 5.1 just doesn't have height. And if you have ever listened to some of these newer presentations of 3D sound, it's fun to listen to them. It is. And so that is what next generation things are about. So also providing height. And there's a whole, a huge discussion going on about how many speakers do you need and where do you need to place them. And
yes, I was going to ask you, there's a difference between having speakers above you in the ceiling, which some companies do provide, like Sound, for example. And then there is simulating that.
Right.
So there's sort of two approaches to that problem.
Right. And that's pretty much like what you can do for stereo and other things. You know that you can either sort of set up speakers, and each speaker can sort of provide sound from a certain direction. And because the sound arrives from that direction onto your ear, it gets this kind of the spatial fingerprint from arriving from that direction. But then again, we have just two ears, and there's a technology called, or the approach is called binaural sound reproduction, which means if we only manage to reproduce correctly the sounds that get into both our ears, then the rest of the listening impression is perfect as well. Now that's of course only mostly true because it needs to be sort of consistent with your visual environment as well. So you wouldn't believe that if you're getting a sound recorded for a church and you're sitting in your living room. But other than that, just from an acoustic point of view, that is certainly true. But what you need to do to make that work in practice is that you sort of really need to get those two ear signals to your ears in a very unimpaired way. So if you're doing it over like sound bars and things like that, there's a lot of crosstalk, and you need to do a lot of tricks to overcome that. And of course, it's probably not going to be perfect, but it's, of course, way more convenient than setting up, say, 22.2 speakers.
Right. Exactly right. Which SRS has done here in the U.S. I've been to their lab where they've got 22 channels of main channels and 2 subwoofer channels, and they're directing sound all over the place in what is called an object-oriented sound environment, which I know you've worked on as well. Why don't you tell us a little about that?
Right. So essentially, there's if you look at technology that is there, you can present sound, spatial sound in at least 3 ways. One way is sort of the traditional one. It's like you assume a certain loudspeaker setup, and you know the position of each loudspeaker. And so what you deliver is a sound channel that is intended for reproduction about your particular speaker. That's the way we do 5.1. That's the way we do stereo. And of course, there's limitation, because what happens if you don't have that speaker? What happens if the speaker is not exactly in the right position? Then the sound sort of impression gets deteriorated to some extent. The next, then there's a second way of doing things that is sort of trying to separate things, and like you do it in the studio, where you've got single instruments, and each instrument is a track, maybe recorded in a different track, and so you talk about a sound object. And with that sound object, what you do, you transmit lots of these sound objects, and on the decoder side, where you know how many loudspeakers you have available and where they are located, then you can sort of pan or render them into with these loudspeakers in a pretty good way. And then there's a third kind of technologies which sort of like tries to represent the whole sound scene in a kind of like matrix way. There's one thing called ambisonics, for instance, which is which I personally would call neither channel oriented nor is it object based. That's
sort of a hybrid, sort of a hybrid between the two.
No, I think it's like a technology of the third kind, so to speak. Yep.
Okay. So do you see object-oriented audio becoming more and more common in the future? I mean, I can imagine, for example, audio-video receivers of the future being able to accept an object-oriented sound file and then direct those objects to whatever speakers it may happen to have. Is that going to be something we're going to see in the next few years, do you think?
Well, I think so. I mean, of course, there's this the quest for supporting more flexible speaker setups, and that you can do ideally with object-oriented sound. You can, if your speaker is in a different position, if you've got fewer or more speakers, no problem with object-oriented sound. However, that having said, it requires really that a lot of the production people, that the music industries, tone meisters, sound engineers, have to more or less completely rethink their production process in the studio. So they are now sort of very much focused, and they know how to do channel-oriented sound. And so there are a lot of things have to be rethought for object-oriented. So I guess from my point of view, the thing is, we'll certainly continue to live in a channel-oriented world, but as time goes on, people will, at least in addition, try to support object-oriented sound, and I'm pretty sure there's going to be a kind of gradual transition, maybe even some kind of hybrid mixed schemes, and which is actually a clever thing to do, right?
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, I can hope for that as well. I think it's a great idea. I would also love to be able to even affect the mix as a listener, and perhaps even place instruments in different places, which is probably a little bit more advanced, a little bit farther down the road, but something we might look forward to.
Yeah, and that is, of course, something that can be pretty easily being done with object-oriented sound, if the render and the format allows it. Because, I mean, not all tone masters and sound engineers jump for joy if you tell them, we're going to sort of remix what you sort of delivered.
Yes, but there is that problem, yes. The mixers, the engineers have spent so much time placing everything where they want it, and now all of a sudden users get to muck that all up. That's maybe not going to be so popular with the content creators.
Right. But then again, there is an increasing community where you say, I'd like to have a karaoke version of that, or I'd like to make my dance mix of that particular thing for tonight, my personal mix. So interactive music is getting more and more sort of adopted, and it's just a new world, a new paradigm, so to speak. And it's fun, of course.
Absolutely. And it sounds like you're going to be right in the thick of it for a long time to come.
Oh, yeah. I do hope so.
Well, listen, thank you so much for being on the show. We really appreciate you staying up late in Germany there, and fascinating conversation. Absolutely wonderful information, and we thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, and so keep up the good and interesting talks, and greetings to all the listeners.
Thank you so much. That's Juergen Herre. You can reach him or read about what he's doing at a couple of different places. One is www.audiolabs-erlangen.com, which is the joint venture between the University of Erlangen and Fraunhofer IIS, where they're doing a lot of this kind of research. Or you can go to the Fraunhofer website at iis.fraunhofer.de, and those of you who speak English more than German would want to click on the English link there. So thanks again, Juergen. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Have a good night. Well,
thank you. And you. Next week, my guest geek is scheduled to be Andrew Jones, renowned speaker designer for Pioneer, who made those incredible speakers, bookshelf speakers, that are so inexpensive and yet sound so good. I can't wait to talk to him about how he achieved that incredible value. And I sure hope you will join me. Until then, geek out.